This is a look at grunge from a whole new angle, Seattle, the scene, and a sound and view that has never been seen before. For the first time ever, we get a look inside Soundgarden, and this view comes from one of its original members, guitarist Kim Thayil's new memoir. There are bands that success could be measured in usual ways. You got album sales, awards, tours, songs that get played decades later. And then there are bands whose success is harder to measure because the real impact isn't just what they did, it's what became possible because of what they did. And Soundgarden belongs in that second category because when we talk about Soundgarden, it's easy to start with the obvious milestones. Rose out of Seattle, major label breakthrough, the shadow of grunge, the beginning of grunge, the power of Cornell's voice, the heaviness of Kim Thayil's guitar, the intelligence and the oddness of songwriting, and the records they made that helped define a moment. Soundgarden expanded on the idea of what a rock band could sound like at a time was kind of looking for a new language. And surprising though, this didn't start in Seattle. It actually started in a small, unique town in Illinois. And now we finally have the story behind this and the story of how grunge became grunge and the story behind the band Soundgarden with this new release, this new book, Kim Thayil's new memoir entitled A Screaming Life, Into the Superunknown with Soundgarden and Beyond. Let's look at that Illinois connection first. It comes right in the beginning of the book. And as Thayil writes his story out in kind of more of a linear fashion, he tells it as how he was growing up, and this story is about his childhood and how this childhood became kind of the foundation for all of this. Thayil was born in Seattle, but he moved to Illinois when he was 5, and Thayil's Indian family moved to a community called Forest Park. And why this is such a big deal is this community played a huge part in not only the Soundgarden story, but also grunge itself. This place was an interesting place. It was one of the United States' first intentionally integrated post-World War II communities. And throughout the book, there's major references made to it and how this deep-seated values of this community provided a really unique dimension to Thayil's identity. This is where he also met original bass player Hiro Yamamoto. He grew up there also. But there was more. There were other connections coming out of that area also. There was Stuart Hallerman. He was behind Pacific Northwest Avis recording studio. This is where Soundgarden and other Seattle bands recorded. And then there's Bruce Pavitt behind the highly influential Sub Pop Records, which basically gave rise to grunge after issuing early releases of Soundgarden's records, Nirvana's records, Mudhoney, to name a few. All of these were released on Sub Pop. And these people, combined with this community-focused upbringing, made Thayil a very dedicated person. Someone who valued community and the people that he and each other relied on. And Thayil describes himself in the book as an outsider shaped by his Indian heritage, immigrant family background, and the experience of help forming Soundgarden within a largely white Seattle punk scene. He comes across as really intelligent, more cerebral, with a dry, kind of funny wit. He's reflective, but he's also emotionally guarded and, again, deeply loyal. Not your typical rock star. And the way he wrote this book with co-writer Alan Tepedelen, he seems less interested in telling a sensationalized rock and roll story. He's more into examining context, creative process, legacy for sure. A big part of this story is legacy, and just the lived reality of being inside Soundgarden. And let's remember what we have here. This is the only living member to have witnessed every chapter of Soundgarden's existence. Kim Thayil offers a viewpoint that no one else can. So we get a very interesting look at a rise of a movement that would transform music and really reshape the industry and leave a lasting mark on culture before anybody realized how far its influence would actually reach. And I think looking back, it's easy to see the rise of grunge as kind of a foregone conclusion, but within these pages of the book, you can see that it really was anything but that. And what makes this story unique is getting to see how this band existed and grew while dealing with the pressure of pretty much changing an industry that pushed back against change and pushed back against a lot of what they were trying to do. All bands struggle. All bands have creative challenges and differences, but this band carried a heavy weight. They created a path that was unknown to not only them, but other bands that were popping up around them all the time. And this path that they created, without knowing at the time, became the road that others followed. Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, all benefited from the trials and tribulations that Soundgarden went through. And as much as Soundgarden achieved, after living inside their world and reading Thayil's recounts of how things played out, you can see what became possible for a ton of other bands because of them. The book really shows how Soundgarden's strength didn't come from everyone thinking the same way. It came from these 4 distinct personalities really kind of pushing against each other, sometimes productively and sometimes with real friction. And Thayil's reflections show a band full of competing instincts and creative disagreements, outside pursuits. He definitely wasn't a big fan of Chris Cornell's Audioslave or the awesome collaboration celebration of Andy Wood from Mother Love Bone's Life, the Temple of the Dog record, which was interesting because that was such a huge record and it did a lot for their career. Andy had some uncertainty over whether their biggest hit, Black Hole Sun, truly represented who they were. I think a lot of this goes back to that loyalty part of him, and it shows how dedicated he was to the band's core character and keeping that intact as they grew, and then other members came and went throughout the band. Thayil comes through as far more than Soundgarden's guitarist in this. He's portrayed as one of the band's essential caretakers, an artist really committed to protecting its identity as the group moved through different artistic growth periods, mainstream success, internal strain, and then periods of reinvention as they went along. Especially now, as a band can only look back and preserve what was created when Chris Cornell was alive. I realize that's one name I haven't really said during a lot of this book review, but of course it does need to be addressed. You learn, without giving too much away, how Cornell grew within the band and how he eventually grew away from the band. Thayil has to confront the inevitable and look back on the events leading up to Cornell's death. And again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but it is the emotional boost that this book needed. And it kind of sounds strange to say that, but I felt Thayil elevated his game here and really searched his soul to be able to tell the story of losing his friend, Chris Cornell. But in the end, you really get a chance to see how Soundgarden's impact extended beyond their own achievements, and that their true legacy lies in the doors that they opened and the boundaries that they expanded and the creative possibilities they made available to those who came after them. Kim Thayil's book provides a very unique look into Soundgarden, into the scene, into grunge, and into a very interesting guy, Kim Thayil. Cool new book, A Screaming Life, Into the Superunknown with Soundgarden and Beyond. Reading Kim's book reminded me of a book that I read last year that expands on the story and a lot that was talked about here. Coming up next, let's take a look at this book, a book that I would call essential for digging into the alternative rock grunge scene from the people who were there. I want to tip you on this book because it expands on the grunge scene and kind of opens it up a little bit, because something big was happening that carried grunge artists and other alternative artists into a place never seen before. Can you guess what it was? Well, this book actually won the Rock Talk Studio Year End Award in 2025 for the best rock and roll book not about a band or a band member. This book is called Lollapalooza, the uncensored story of alternative rock's wildest festival. It is a wild ride. It is a great book. It actually features a foreword from Kim in the book, and he talks about how in the beginning he really wasn't into Lollapalooza at first, and he also goes into the Lollapalooza tour and how that all came together from the band in his own book. This one is an oral history of the first 7 years of the festival, and it has contributions for everybody. There's so many people in this. Perry Farrell, of course, members of Jane's Addiction, Pearl Jam, the Soundgarden guys, 9 Inch Nails, Sonic Youth's here, Tool's in here, Smashing Pumpkins, Ice-T, Rage Against the Machine, Green Day, Patti Smith, Alice in Chains, Metallica. I mean, the list is huge and the contribution is huge. Lollapalooza began as this alternative dream, Perry Farrell's vision for a cultural mishmash, and it grew into something that not even Perry could imagine. And with this book, you get a very deep inside look. I don't think you can get any closer to the Lollapalooza experience than this. It's a wild tale told by the people who were there. Great book that shows you kind of where these grunge acts were in their career and how this quick rise was perceived by their peers and those around the Lollapalooza scene. Highly recommend this. If you want to learn more about it and get the full review, you can go back in the archives. The archives are free all the way back to issue number 1, but this one appears in episode 67 if you want to go back and check it out. All right, it's time to tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road for this week. I'll catch you next time in the Rock Talk studio.